Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. I remember the first time I felt something was wrong. It wasn't a big moment, nothing dramatic, nothing you'd notice unless you were looking for it. Melissa sat on the other end of the couch, phone in hand, her eyes glued to the screen. This had become routine for her lately. Casual scrolling, but with an intensity I'd never seen before. The smile she used to save for me now flickered across her face while she stared at that damn phone. I tried not to think much of it at first. It's just social media, I told myself. Everyone's on their phones these days. But that night, something felt different. There was a name on the screen just for a second, a name that hit me like a gut punch. Derek. I didn't say anything. I didn't react. Just filed it away, pretending to be focused on the TV. But my mind was racing. Derek? It wasn't a name that came up in our conversations before. And the way she quickly tilted the phone screen away from me the moment she noticed I glanced at it? Yeah, that wasn't a coincidence. 1,000 possibilities crossed my mind, but I pushed them aside. Couldn't jump to conclusions. Not yet. The room was silent, but the tension hung heavy. I felt it. She felt it. It's amazing how the smallest things can set off alarms when you've been married for 22 years. It's like you can sense the cracks before they even form. And lately there were cracks everywhere. Melissa hadn't been the same for months. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when things started to shift, but it had been building. She was distant, spent more time at work, started dressing differently. Nothing too obvious, but just enough to make me notice. She'd leave the house 4 hours without telling me where she was going, and when she got back, there was always some vague excuse. I needed some space, or I'm swamped at the office. I tried to be the supportive husband, giving her room to breathe. But the more I did, the more she slipped away. It was like living with a stranger. And now, with that name, Derek, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was going on. That night, while she was in the shower, I made a decision. I wasn't proud of it, but I couldn't ignore the growing knot in my gut. Her phone was sitting on the bathroom counter, screen dark, just waiting for me. My hand shook as I picked it up. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing to my ears. Was I really about to do this? Hell yes, I was. I needed answers. I swiped her phone open. Thankfully, she hadn't changed the passcode. My thumb hovered over the Messages app, hesitation creeping in for a second. But only a second. I tapped it, and there it was. The first name in the list. Derek. The conversation wasn't long, but it didn't need to be. A few lines back and forth were all it took to confirm what I had feared. They weren't talking about work. They weren't even pretending to. The texts were short but flirty. It was clear they had been seeing each other, and they were planning to meet again soon. I stood there, phone in hand, staring at the messages like an idiot. My chest felt tight, and I could hear the water still running in the shower behind the door. Every muscle in my body tensed. For a second, I wanted to burst in, confront her, demand answers. But something stopped me. No, I couldn't blow up yet, not before I knew everything. So I put the phone down, placed it exactly where I found it, and walked back into the bedroom like nothing had happened. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The words from her messages burned into my brain. Can't wait to see you tomorrow after work. I wish I didn't have to go home to him. That line hit me harder than anything. Him, that's what I had become. Just some guy she had to go home to. 22 years of marriage, 2 kids, and that's all I was to her now. But I wasn't going to fall apart. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me broken. No, I had to play this smart. She wasn't going to walk all over me. The next few days were a blur of fake smiles and quiet planning. Melissa went about her usual routine, acting like everything was fine. She had no idea that I was on to her. Every time she said she had to stay late at the office, I knew exactly where she was going and who she was with. I started watching her closely. Every move, every text, every lie. I became an observer in my own life, collecting details, waiting for the right moment. There was no more guessing. This was real, and I needed to be ready for whatever came next. I knew I couldn't confront her right away. That would be too easy, too messy. I had to make sure I had all the facts before I pulled the trigger. She wasn't just going to walk out of this unscathed. No, she was going to feel every ounce of pain she'd caused me. The late nights became more frequent, and each one felt like a knife to the gut. Every time she walked through the door with that fake smile, my stomach turned. But I kept my cool. I had to. One night, I pretended to go to bed early. She was in the living room texting, probably making plans to meet Derek again. I crept down the hallway, heart pounding in my chest, and peeked around the corner. She didn't notice me. I watched her for a few minutes, the way she smiled at her phone, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the room next to her. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just angry, I was furious. But I wasn't going to lose control. No, I was going to make her pay. She thought she could keep this up, that I was too clueless to see what was right in front of me. But she was wrong. The turning point came when I found a message that sent my blood boiling. It was simple, but it said everything. I can't wait until you're mine. That was from her to Derek. The nerve. She was already planning a life without me, already thinking about what came next. But she wasn't going to get there. Not on my watch. I didn't sleep that night. My mind was racing, plotting, figuring out exactly how I'd take control of the situation. There wasn't going to be some dramatic blow-up. I wouldn't give her the chance to play the victim. No, I was going to be smart about this. Calculated. By the time the sun rose, I had a plan. I wasn't going to confront her until I had everything I needed. I would catch her in the act, expose her for who she really was, and make sure everyone knew. She wasn't just going to lose me, she was going to lose everything. The next morning, Melissa acted like nothing was wrong. She made breakfast, kissed the kids, and left for work with a smile. I played along, kissed her on the cheek, and told her to have a great day. She had no idea that her life was about to implode. As soon as she was out the door, I grabbed her phone and started digging deeper. There were more messages, more plans to meet up with Derek after work. It was all right there, laid out in front of me like a roadmap to her betrayal. I took screenshots, saved everything I could. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. That night, she came home late again, claiming some work emergency. I could barely look at her. She had no clue that I knew exactly where she'd been. And that's when I saw it, that look of satisfaction on her face. She thought she had me fooled, but she didn't. And soon she was going to realize just how big of a mistake she made. I read through her messages one more time that night, my anger building with every word, and then I saw the final blow. I wish I didn't have to go home to him. I stared at those words for what felt like an eternity. My world crumbled in that moment, but my resolve only hardened. This wasn't just some affair. She didn't just cheat on me, she replaced me. She didn't even see me as her husband anymore. Just him. But I wasn't going to be him for long. My plan was in motion, and soon she was going to find out exactly what that meant. I became methodical. After that night, after reading the words that finally shattered whatever naive hope I had left, I knew I couldn't act on impulse. Not yet. I had to be smart, gather everything, prepare myself, and ensure that when I finally confronted her, I'd be holding all the cards. So I started watching her closely, much more than I ever had before. Melissa's routines became predictable. Late nights, the excuse of more work piling up, the extra effort she put into how she looked before leaving the house. It was all so obvious now, and it pissed me off that I hadn't seen it sooner. She thought she had me fooled, but every single lie was just another layer I was adding to the case I was building against her. Her phone was my first priority. Every time she'd leave it lying around, I'd grab it. I'd scroll through the messages, quickly reading through her conversations with Derek. It was sickening how casually they talked, like what they were doing wasn't ripping our family apart. I screenshotted everything. Every flirty message, every mention of their secret meetings. I wasn't going to let a single piece of evidence slip through my fingers. I couldn't confront her yet, though. It wasn't enough to just call her out and watch her squirm. That wasn't going to cut it. I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she'd done. I wanted to destroy her in a way that left no room for her to crawl back from. And it wasn't just about her. It was about Derek, too. That asshole wasn't going to walk away unscathed. The more I observed, the more I noticed her slipping. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Melissa would smile at her phone while we were sitting at the dinner table, completely disconnected from our family. The kids noticed too, but they were too young to understand what was really going on. They just saw their mom slipping away, more distant by the day. It made me feel like I was failing them, that somehow I wasn't protecting them from the mess she was creating. At home, I played the part, smiled when I needed to, acted like everything was fine. The tension, though, was starting to seep into every room, every interaction. Even the kids were picking up on the coldness between us. They asked fewer questions, probably sensing that something wasn't right. I hated seeing the confusion in their eyes, but I couldn't involve them in this. Not yet. I needed to keep them protected from what was coming. But Melissa, she was oblivious. She was too wrapped up in her affair with Derek to even notice how detached I'd become. Maybe she thought I was too dense to pick up on it. Maybe she just didn't care anymore. Either way, it worked to my advantage. The more distracted she was, the easier it was for me to continue my investigation without raising suspicion. I started following her. I wasn't proud of it, but I had to know for sure. When she'd leave for her supposed late nights at work, I'd wait for about 15 minutes, then grab my car keys and tail her from a distance. The first few times, she did actually go to the office, but it wasn't long before she slipped up. One Thursday evening, I followed her as usual, expecting her to head to the office again. But instead, she drove right past it, heading across town to a hotel. The sight of her car pulling into that parking lot hit me like a freight train. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. She had no idea I was right behind her, watching her as she parked, as she casually walked inside like it was the most normal thing in the world. I waited for a few minutes, watching from a distance as another car pulled up. Derek. It was him, I knew it. The smug look on his face as he walked into the hotel after her made me want to drive over and deck him right there in the parking lot. But I held back. There'd be time for that later. I stayed parked for nearly an hour, my mind racing. The proof was right there in front of me, but I couldn't act on it just yet. No, this had to be handled carefully. I had to document everything, make sure that when I finally confronted her, there'd be no way out for her, no excuses, no lies to cover it up. That night, after she came home, I watched her slip into bed like she'd just had another normal day at work. She smiled at me like everything was fine, like she hadn't just spent the last few hours in a hotel room with Derek. I almost wanted to laugh at how blind she thought I was. But instead, I kept my face neutral, gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, and told her goodnight. The rage was boiling inside me, but I kept it down. It wasn't time yet. The following days, I kept gathering evidence. I started keeping a journal, writing down every suspicious thing she did, every lie she told. I logged the times she left the house, the hours she spent away, the texts, the calls. I made sure I had every detail nailed down. This wasn't going to be some emotional, chaotic blow-up. I was going to dismantle her life systematically, piece by piece, just like she had done to mine. But I couldn't shake the anger. It sat with me constantly, right under the surface. It didn't help that Melissa kept acting like everything was normal. She played the perfect wife, the loving mother, all while sneaking off to be with him. It disgusted me. But every time I felt like I was going to lose it, I reminded myself of the bigger picture. I couldn't act yet. I had to stick to the plan. Then something shifted. Melissa was starting to get careless. She wasn't even trying to hide her texts anymore. One evening, while we were sitting at the kitchen table, I glanced over at her phone, which was lit up with another message from Derek. She didn't even try to tilt the screen away from me this time. It was almost like she wanted to get caught, like she didn't care if I saw. That was the moment I knew the time was coming. She was getting sloppy, and it wouldn't be long before everything came crashing down. I wasn't going to let her just walk away from this. No, she was going to pay for every single lie, every single betrayal. I started planning my next move. It wasn't enough to just confront her. I needed to make sure this hit her where it hurt the most, publicly. Her entire life was about to unravel, and I was going to be the one to pull the thread. I thought about Derek, too, how he thought he could just step in and take over my life like it was nothing. He didn't know what was coming for him. I was going to make sure his life fell apart just as hard as hers. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. And then one night, after another one of her late nights at work, I waited for her in the kitchen. I sat at the table, her phone in my hand, waiting for her to come home. I didn't feel the usual anger this time, just cold determination. She walked in, not even noticing me at first. But when she saw me sitting there, her face froze. She knew something was off. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I just looked at her, holding her phone in my hand. Her eyes widened, and for the first time in months, I saw real fear on her face. She didn't know what I'd seen, didn't know what I was about to do. But she knew right then and there that her lies were about to catch up with her. I let the silence hang for a moment, watching her squirm. It felt good seeing her like that, unsure, vulnerable. She wasn't in control anymore. I was. "Melissa," I finally said, my voice calm, steady, "we need to talk." Her face went pale, and I could see her mentally scrambling, trying to figure out what to say, but there was nothing she could say. The truth was right there in my hand, and she knew it. "I know about Derek," I continued, still calm. "I know everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Melissa opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She just stood there, frozen, as the weight of what was happening finally hit her. I didn't give her the chance to respond. I stood up, handed her the phone, and walked past her, heading straight for the bedroom. I had nothing more to say, not yet. The real conversation would come later, after I had finished preparing. She didn't follow me. She just stood there, phone in hand, staring after me like she didn't even know who I was anymore. In that moment, I realized something. I wasn't the man she thought she could fool. I wasn't weak, wasn't clueless. I was in control now, and soon she'd realize just how much of a mistake she had made. I went to bed that night feeling more certain than ever. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. The web had tightened around her, and there was no escape. She was caught, and now it was only a matter of time before everything she had built on it came crashing down around her. Tomorrow, I'd take the next step. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling more focused than I had in months. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Melissa was still asleep, curled up on her side of the bed, her face peaceful in a way that felt mocking now. She had no idea what was coming. Today was the day I'd confront her, not in anger or rage, but in cold, calculated control. There was no going back from this, and honestly, I didn't want to. I left the bed quietly, went downstairs, and made myself a cup of coffee. I needed the clarity that only a silent morning could bring before the storm. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about how I'd handle this, how I'd lay it all out for her with no emotion, just facts. She'd have no room to squirm, no chance to deflect or manipulate her way out of it. I wasn't playing into her narrative anymore. I was writing my own. I was deep in thought when I heard her footsteps on the stairs. She was up now, probably heading to the kitchen like it was just another day. I stayed seated at the table, phone in hand, waiting. I had everything ready, the texts, the calls, the lies, all stored neatly in folders. Her betrayal, neatly categorized and undeniable. She walked into the kitchen and gave me a half-hearted smile. "Morning," she said, her voice casual, oblivious to the weight of what was about to happen. "Sit down," I said, my voice steady, betraying nothing. Her smile faltered. She knew something was off. She hesitated for a second, but then pulled out a chair across from me. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to sound calm, but failing. "I know about Derek," I said. I didn't give her time to react. I slid the phone across the table toward her, the screen already opened to one of their conversations. "I've known for a while." Melissa stared at the screen, her face draining of color. Her eyes flickered with panic as she scrolled through the messages, realizing that there was no way out of this. "Kevin, I can explain," she started, her voice trembling. "Don't," I cut her off. "You don't get to explain. I've been watching you lie to me for months, smiling in my face while you sneak around behind my back. You don't get to explain anything." She was silent for a moment, looking down at her hands like they held the answers to fix this. But there was no fixing this. "It wasn't like that," she mumbled, weakly grasping at straws. "I've just been so unhappy. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear." Unhappy, that word. She'd been saying it for months now, like it was some excuse for everything she was doing. "Unhappy?" I repeated, leaning forward. "You didn't look too unhappy in those messages, Melissa. You didn't seem too miserable when you were sneaking off to hotels with him while I stayed here, clueless. Was that your idea of working through your unhappiness?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. "Not anymore. Maybe a few months ago I would have felt something, some twinge of empathy or sadness. But now I just felt cold. I didn't want it to get this far," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you." That line, that predictable, cliched line, made me laugh. I couldn't help it. "Never wanted to hurt me? You've been cheating on me for months, Melissa. Don't insult me by pretending this wasn't a choice. Every time you lied, every time you snuck out, you made a decision. Don't try to act like you're the victim here." She wiped her eyes, looking down at the table, but I wasn't done. "And don't even think about bringing up the kids," I said sharply. "You weren't thinking about them when you were with him. You don't get to use them as an excuse now." She flinched at that, but it was the truth. The kids had been part of this mess too, unknowingly caught in the Cold War between us, and that was unforgivable. For a few moments there was silence between us, the air thick with everything left unsaid. Melissa kept her eyes down, probably trying to figure out how to salvage something from the wreckage. But there was nothing left to save. "I'm going to need some time to think," I said finally, breaking the silence. "I'm not filing for divorce yet, but don't mistake that for anything other than what it is. I need time, but this, what you've done, there's no coming back from it." Her head snapped up at that, panic flashing across her face. She wasn't expecting that. Maybe she thought I'd react in a blind rage, that I'd throw everything into chaos and walk away immediately. But I was staying, for now. I had a plan, and it didn't involve her having the upper hand. "Not yet." "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice shaky. "It means you'll find out soon enough," I said, standing up and walking out of the room without another word. I wasn't going to waste any more breath on her excuses or apologies. As I walked upstairs, I felt the weight of what I had just set in motion. This wasn't just about us anymore. I had started a chain reaction that was going to pull in everyone involved, and I wasn't going to stop until everyone paid the price for this betrayal. That meant Derek, too. He wasn't getting away with this. He thought he could step into my life, take my wife, and just keep going like nothing happened. No, I was going to make sure his world collapsed, just like mine had. I spent the next few days preparing for what was coming next. Melissa avoided me, her guilt weighing her down, but that was fine. It gave me the space I needed to set everything in motion. I reached out to a divorce lawyer, making sure I had every detail in order. I wasn't rushing this, wasn't going to give her any leverage. This was going to be airtight, and when I finally hit her with it, there'd be no way for her to manipulate her way out. I also reached out to Derek's wife. She deserved to know the truth. I didn't know her well, just a few interactions here and there when Melissa and I attended work events together, but I knew she had no idea what her husband had been doing behind her back. That was about to change. I spent hours crafting the email, making sure it was concise but detailed enough to leave no doubt in her mind. I attached screenshots of the text, the proof that would shatter whatever trust she still had in Derek. When I finally hit send, I felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. Melissa had no idea what was coming. She still walked around the house in that awkward silence, hoping maybe I'd forgive her, that I'd move past it and we could salvage something. But I wasn't moving past anything. I was biding my time, waiting for the right moment to pull the rug out from under her, and when I did, it would be brutal. Days passed and the tension in the house grew thicker. Melissa was on edge, probably sensing that something was coming, but not knowing what. She tiptoed around me, trying to act normal in front of the kids, but they weren't stupid. They could feel the distance, the coldness between us. I hated that they were caught in the middle, but there was nothing I could do to shield them from what was about to happen. Then, it happened. One evening, after yet another night of awkward silence and fake smiles, I waited for her in the living room. She walked in, hesitant, probably wondering why I was sitting there, so calm, so collected. She had no idea. I gave her a look, the kind that let her know I wasn't playing around anymore. I could see the panic in her eyes as she sat down across from me, waiting for the inevitable. "I've been thinking," I said slowly, keeping my voice steady, "about everything, about what you've done." She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up my hand to stop her. "Don't, just listen." Melissa swallowed, nodding, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew it wasn't going to be good. "I've spoken to a lawyer," I said, watching her face closely for a reaction. "I'm going to file for divorce." Her breath hitched, but she didn't say anything. She just sat there, waiting, her hands trembling slightly. "I've also spoken to Derek's wife," I continued, letting the weight of my words sink in. "She knows everything now, every loan, every meeting, every text. She's filing for divorce too." Melissa's eyes widened in horror, the realization hitting her all at once. "Kevin, you didn't—" "I did," I said coldly. "And there's more. I've gathered all the evidence I need to make sure this divorce goes exactly the way I want it to. You're not getting the kids. You're not getting the house. You're walking away with nothing." She broke then. The sobs that she had been holding in finally escaped, and she collapsed into the couch, her hands covering her face as she cried, "Please, Kevin, don't do this. We can fix this." "No," I said, standing up. "You can't fix this. You broke it, and now you're going to live with the consequences." I walked out of the room, leaving her there to deal with the reality of what was about to happen. The satisfaction I felt wasn't as sweet as I'd imagined, but it was enough. She was finally feeling the weight of what she'd done, and there was no escaping it. I went upstairs and grabbed my phones. There was one final message from my lawyer. Everything was in place. The papers were ready, and by tomorrow morning, Melissa's world would officially fall apart. I couldn't help but smirk as I closed the message. My revenge wasn't over yet. Tomorrow, I'd finish what I started. The day had finally come. It was time to set my plan in motion, and I was ready. Everything had been prepared, down to the smallest detail. I had the divorce papers signed and ready to be delivered, all the evidence meticulously gathered, and a family gathering arranged for that evening. Melissa, still clinging to the hope that we could somehow reconcile, had no idea what was about to hit her. I watched her that morning, still pretending to play the part of the attentive husband. It was almost amusing now, the way she seemed desperate to salvage whatever was left, still blind to the fact that I had already taken everything from her. Every fake smile, every forced conversation was just fuel to my fire. I told her we were hosting a small family gathering to celebrate our upcoming anniversary. That was the hook. Melissa, not suspecting a thing, agreed without hesitation, probably thinking this was my way of softening up, of rethinking my decision. She even smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in what felt like forever. "Maybe we can make things work," she said quietly as we prepared for the night. I didn't respond, just nodded, letting her believe what she wanted. Her delusions only made what was coming all the more satisfying. As the afternoon wore on, our friends and family began to arrive one by one. I could feel the tension building inside me, but I kept it buried deep. Tonight wasn't just about exposing her. It was about completely dismantling the life she thought she could control. And I wanted every single person in that room to witness it. I stood at the door, greeting guests as they walked in, my mind racing through the sequence of events I had meticulously planned. I had my laptop set up in the living room, ready to project the evidence. The texts, the photos, the recordings, everything that would leave no doubt about what she had done. This wasn't just about me confronting her anymore. It was about making sure everyone knew who she really was. Melissa moved through the room, playing the perfect hostess, chatting with friends, laughing at their jokes. She looked so comfortable, so confident. It made me sick. She had no idea that tonight her world was about to come crashing down in front of everyone she cared about. About halfway through the evening, when everyone had arrived and the small talk had settled, I decided it was time. My heart raced, but not from nerves. It was anticipation. The moment I had been building toward was finally here. I cleared my throat and called for everyone's attention, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Hey everyone," I began, offering a tight smile to the room. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. There's something I need to share, something important." The room quieted, all eyes turning to me. Melissa stood near the back, smiling, but I saw the flicker of confusion cross her face. She hadn't expected this. "I know most of you are here because you think we're celebrating our anniversary," I continued, "but tonight's about something else, something much more personal." I paused for a moment, letting the weight of my words hang in the air before I walked over to the laptop. Melissa's smile faltered, and I could see her shifting uneasily, her eyes darting between me and the computer. "I've spent the last few months uncovering something that I think everyone here needs to know about. Something Melissa has been hiding from all of us." My voice was cold, but measured. I wasn't going to explode. Wasn't going to let her see how deep my anger ran. This was about control. I had all the power now, and I was going to use it. I clicked a button, and the screen behind me lit up with the first set of text messages. The room was dead silent as the words flashed across the screen. There were gaps, murmurs, people turning to each other in shock. And then Melissa's face went pale. She froze, her entire body stiffening as she realized what was happening. On the screen, message after message scrolled by. Conversations between her and Derek, full of flirtation, full of betrayal. The late-night plans, the lies about working late. Every dirty detail of their affair laid bare for everyone to see. I didn't look at her, I couldn't. My eyes stayed focused on the screen, on the truth unraveling in front of everyone. I wanted her to feel what I had felt all those nights when I had sat alone, knowing she was out with him. The silence in the room was suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. I could feel the weight of the shock, the disbelief, and then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw her move. Melissa stepped forward, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form words, but nothing came out. Her face was white, her hands shaking. She looked like she was about to faint. "Kevin, please don't do this," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I turned to her then, locking eyes with her for the first time since I'd started. "Don't worry," I said, my voice steady and cold. "It gets worse." And it did. I clicked the next file, and this time, photos filled the screen. Pictures of her and Derek together, in hotels, in restaurants, in cars. All of it captured and displayed for everyone to see. Her lies, her deceit, now public knowledge. That was when the room erupted. People started whispering, some even shouting, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. A few of her closest friends rushed to her side, trying to comfort her, but she just stood there, trembling. But I wasn't finished. "You thought you could keep this secret," I said, stepping toward her. "You thought you could betray me, betray our family, and get away with it. But now everyone knows, Melissa. Now everyone knows who you really are." Tears streamed down her face, and she tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come. She just stood there, completely broken, as her life fell apart in front of her. That's when Derek's wife walked in. She had been waiting outside, just as planned. When she stepped into the room, her face was a mask of fury. Melissa saw her, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. Derek's wife marched straight up to Melissa and slapped her, hard. The sound echoed through the room, cutting through the chaos. "You home-wrecking bitch," she screamed. "You ruined everything. My marriage, my family, you took it all for what? For some pathetic fling?" Melissa collapsed then, falling to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. She tried to speak, tried to apologize, but Derek's wife wasn't having any of it. "You think saying sorry is going to fix this? You think you can just walk away from what you've done? You destroyed everything." Derek's wife turned to me then, her eyes blazing with anger, but also gratitude. "Thank you for letting me know. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow." With that, she stormed out of the room, leaving Melissa a sobbing wreck on the floor. I watched her for a moment, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. She had begged, she had lied, and now she had lost. Everything. But my job wasn't done. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked the message from my lawyer. Everything was in place. I turned to Melissa one last time, my voice low but firm. "Divorce papers will be served in the morning. You're not getting the kids. You're not getting the house. You're getting nothing." She didn't respond. She couldn't. She just stayed there on the floor, broken, humiliated, and utterly defeated. I turned and walked out of the room, my heart racing, but not from anger anymore. It was over. My revenge was complete. As I left the house, the night air hit me like a wave, cool and refreshing. I pulled out my phone again and shot a quick text to my lawyer, confirming that everything was ready. Tomorrow, she would officially lose it all. I didn't feel the overwhelming satisfaction I thought I would. It wasn't as sweet as I had imagined, but it was enough. She had ruined my life, and now I had ruined hers. That was the only justice I was ever going to get. As I drove away, the messages and photos replayed in my mind, but this time they didn't hurt. They didn't sting the way they had before. Now they were just memories of a life I had left behind. I wasn't finished with my revenge. There was still one final step to take, but that would come tomorrow. Tonight, I would sleep knowing that Melissa would never be able to rebuild from this. She would never recover from the destruction she had caused. And that, more than anything, was enough. The next morning came, and with it, a sense of finality. I woke up early, feeling oddly calm. The air was still, the house quiet, almost too quiet. I could hear Melissa moving around downstairs, probably hoping for some miracle that would stop everything from crashing down. But today, there were no miracles. Today, everything was about consequences. I made myself a cup of coffee, ignoring the tension in the house. It was suffocating, like everything was teetering on the edge of a cliff, and I was about to push it over. Melissa stayed out of sight for most of the morning, probably hoping I wouldn't follow through. But there was no backing out now. This wasn't about rage or revenge anymore. This was about closing the door on everything she destroyed. Around noon, I got the text I'd been waiting for. The divorce papers had been officially filed, and Melissa would be served by the end of the day. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting that sink in. It should have felt more satisfying, but all I felt was cold, like the emotions had already burned through me. Still, it was done. The first domino had fallen. As I finished my coffee, I heard a knock at the door. I glanced at the clock. It was early for anyone to be coming by, especially today. I made my way to the front door, my mind already half checked out of whatever this interruption was. But when I opened the door, all that calm disappeared. Derek stood there. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled, his face unshaven. There was anger in his eyes, but behind it, there was something else. Desperation. He shoved his hands in his pockets and stared at me for a second, like he was trying to figure out where to start. "We need to talk," he finally said, his voice rough and low. I didn't move. I wasn't letting this guy into my house, not after everything. The audacity of him showing up here, at my door, like he had anything left to say was almost laughable. I leaned against the door frame, crossing my arms, keeping my face as neutral as I could. "No," I said simply, "we don't." His jaw clenched, but he didn't back down. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "You think this..." He gestured toward the house, like the entire mess of our lives was somehow contained inside. You think this is over just because you put it all out there? You think you've destroyed everything and now you get to walk away? I stared at him, unmoved. I already have. He took a step forward, his face twisting with anger. You've ruined my life, Kevin. You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to drag everything into the open. We could have kept it quiet, dealt with it like adults. I laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through the tension like a knife. Quiet? I repeated. You think this was ever going to be quiet? You think you and Melissa were just going to ride off into the sunset and no one was going to find out? You destroyed 2 families, Derek. There's no quiet when you do that. He flinched at my words, but he didn't back down. You didn't have to go this far, he insisted, his voice dropping. You didn't have to humiliate her like that. Like me. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, my voice cold and controlled. You think I did this for you? You think this was about humiliating you? No, Derek, this was about making sure you and Melissa face the consequences of what you did. You made your choices, and now you're going to live with them. He glared at me, but there was something broken in his eyes now, like he wasn't sure what his next move should be. You can't just destroy everything, he muttered almost to himself. I shook my head. I didn't destroy anything, Derek. You did. You and Melissa. I just made sure everyone saw what was already there. He was silent for a moment, staring down at the ground, his hands balling into fists at his sides. I could see the frustration boiling inside him, the anger that had nowhere to go. He wanted to fight, but there was nothing left to fight for. The truth was out. There was no putting it back in the box. Finally, he looked up at me, his face tight with barely contained fury. You think this is over? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. You think you've won? I met his gaze, unflinching. Yes. For a long moment, we just stood there, staring at each other, the silence heavy between us. Then, without another word, Derek turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched, his fists still clenched at his sides. I watched him go, feeling nothing but the cold certainty that I had been right. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about closure. I closed the door and stood there for a moment, the house feeling even quieter than before. Derek had tried to bring his anger to my doorstep, but it hadn't worked. There was nothing left for him to say. The consequences were already in motion, and there was no stopping them now. I walked back into the kitchen, my mind still processing the confrontation. I hadn't expected Derek to show up, but it didn't matter. His life was falling apart just as fast as Melissa's. That's what happens when you build everything on lies. It all comes crashing down sooner or later. As I sat down, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was from my lawyer confirming that Melissa had been served with the divorce papers. It was done. Official. There was no turning back now. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. It was strange. I had been so focused on this moment, on getting to this point, that now that it was here, I wasn't sure what to do next. The rage, the need for revenge, it had been driving me for so long. But now that it was finished, there was just emptiness. So, I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't the end of everything. There would still be fallout, still be moments where the hurt came rushing back. But for now, the war was over. Melissa had been exposed. Derek had been confronted. The divorce was in motion. Everything was falling into place. But it didn't feel like victory. I picked up my phone, staring at the screen for a moment before dialing a familiar number. It rang twice before my lawyer picked up. Hey, Kevin, she said, her voice professional but warm. I saw that the papers were served. Everything's moving forward as planned. Yeah, I said, rubbing my eyes. Thanks for all your help with this. Of course, I know this is a tough time, but you've handled it well. Just keep focusing on what's next, okay? I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Yeah, I will. After we hung up, I sat there in the silence, trying to wrap my head around what next even meant. There was no going back to what my life had been. Everything had changed, but for the first time in a long time, that didn't feel like a bad thing. Maybe I could finally start moving forward, start thinking about my life without Melissa in it. That thought didn't bring the peace I expected, but it brought something else, a sense of clarity. I had spent so much time being consumed by what she had done, by how much she had hurt me, that I hadn't thought about what I wanted next. What I needed. I wasn't sure if I was ready to figure that out yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let her or Derek control my life anymore. They were part of the pace, part of the mess I was leaving behind. And from now on, I was going to focus on building something new. It wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in months, I felt like I had a shot at something better, something real, without the lies, without the betrayal, and that was a start. The day passed slowly after that, but I didn't feel rushed. Melissa stayed in her room, probably still trying to process everything that had happened, but I didn't go to her. There was nothing left to say. Later that evening, after the kids were settled in for the night, I found myself standing in front of the window, staring out at the street. The sky was dark, the stars hidden behind a blanket of clouds. It felt fitting somehow, like everything was waiting for the storm to pass. As I stood there, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an old friend, someone I hadn't talked to in a long time. He suggested we grab a drink sometime, catch up. It was a simple message, nothing special, but it felt like an olive branch. A chance to reconnect, to remember that there was more to my life than this mess. I hesitated for a second before typing out a response. Sounds good. Let me know when. As I hit send, there was a knock at the door. For a split second, I thought it might be Derek again, coming back for round two. But when I opened the door, I wasn't surprised to see Melissa standing there, looking fragile, her eyes swollen from crying. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice small and shaky. I leaned against the door frame, studying her for a moment. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, to tell her there was nothing left to say. But another part of me, the part that had shared 2 decades with her, felt the weight of everything we'd been through. The history that couldn't be erased, no matter how much I wanted to. "Talk about what?" I finally said, my voice flat. She bit her lip, glancing down at the floor. "About everything. About us." I shook my head slowly. "There is no us anymore, Melissa." She looked up at me, tears brimming in her eyes again. "Please, I know I screwed up. I know I ruined everything. But we can fix it. We can at least try. For the kids." I let out a bitter laugh, pushing away from the door. "For the kids? You didn't care about them when you were sneaking around with Derek. Don't use them now to try to fix something that's broken beyond repair." Her shoulders slumped, the weight of my words hitting her hard. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know it doesn't mean anything now, but I am. I never wanted to hurt you." I stared at her, feeling nothing but the cold finality of the truth. "It's too late for that, Melissa. You already did." Without waiting for a response, I shut the door. And that was it, the final confrontation, the end of what we had built together. As I walked away from the door, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. There was no going back now, and for the first time, I was okay with that. Tomorrow, I'd start the next chapter of my life. The next few weeks passed in a blur. There were moments when everything felt surreal, as if I was watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. My days were filled with paperwork, meetings with my lawyer, and trying to keep things as normal as possible for the kids. They didn't know the full extent of what had happened yet, but they sensed something had shifted. They weren't asking questions, at least not directly, but I knew it wouldn't be long before they wanted to understand why everything felt different. For now, I focused on the practical side of things. The divorce was moving forward smoothly, more smoothly than I'd expected, given the chaos it had caused in our lives. Melissa had finally accepted that this wasn't going to be a situation she could manipulate her way out of. Once the reality hit her, she became quiet, distant, like a ghost of the person she used to be. I didn't engage with her unless absolutely necessary, and even then it was strictly business. She didn't try to argue or negotiate anymore. Maybe she knew there was no point. The damage was done and there was no fixing it. I'd moved out of the house a week after that final conversation. Staying under the same roof, even for the sake of the kids, was unbearable. Every corner of that place felt tainted by what had happened, every room holding some reminder of the betrayal. It was suffocating. So I found a small apartment across town, a temporary place until I could figure out what came next. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that was what mattered. The kids came to stay with me on weekends, and that was the hardest part, trying to explain why things were changing without tearing their world apart. I told them the basics, that their mom and I weren't going to be together anymore, that sometimes adults grow apart. I left out the part about the affair, about Derek, about how their mother had thrown our entire family away for someone else. They didn't need to know that, at least not yet. They just needed to know that I was still there for them no matter what. Melissa didn't fight for custody. It was as if she had given up entirely. The guilt must have weighed too heavily on her, or maybe she didn't have the energy to fight after everything came crashing down. Either way, I got full custody of the kids, and she was left to pick up the pieces of whatever was left of her life. I didn't know what that looked like for her anymore, and to be honest, I didn't care. I was too focused on rebuilding my own life. One evening, about a month after the divorce papers had been filed, I found myself sitting on a park bench watching the kids play on the swings. It was one of those rare moments where everything felt normal. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the playground, and the air was crisp with the first hints of autumn. The kids were laughing, their voices carrying through the air, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. This was what mattered now. Not the betrayal, not the revenge, not the wreckage of my marriage. This, being here with my kids, seeing them smile, knowing that we could move forward, this was my future. I had spent so much time consumed by anger, by the need to make Melissa pay for what she'd done, that I hadn't stopped to think about what came after. But now, sitting there, I realized that there was an after. There was a life waiting for me on the other side of all the pain. And it didn't have to be defined by what had happened. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old messages as the kids played. There was one message in particular that I kept coming back to, the one from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. He'd suggested we grab a drink, catch up on life, and I told him it sounded good. But I hadn't followed up. I wasn't sure why. Maybe part of me had been stuck in the past, in the mess of it all. But now it felt like the right time to reconnect. I typed out a quick response. "Hey, are you still up for that drink?" I hit send and pocketed the phone, watching as the kids ran back toward me, their cheeks flushed from the cold air. They were happy. Despite everything that had happened, they were okay, and that was more than I could have hoped for. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was a reply from my friend. "Definitely, let's do it this weekend. It's been too long." I smiled, feeling a strange sense of relief. Maybe this was what I needed, a reminder that life goes on, that there are people out there who still care, who still want to be a part of my life even after everything that had happened. It wasn't just about picking up the pieces, it was about building something new. That weekend, I met my friend at a bar downtown. It was a low-key place, not too crowded, the kind of spot where you could actually have a conversation without yelling over the music. We grabbed a couple of beers, found a table in the corner, and caught up on everything that had happened since we'd last seen each other. He didn't ask too many questions about the divorce, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't ready to rehash all of it just yet. Instead, we talked about work, about old memories, about everything except the mess I just crawled out of. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the guy who had been cheated on, not the guy who had been consumed by revenge, but just me. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Over the next few weeks, I slowly started reconnecting with other friends, people I hadn't reached out to in ages. It wasn't easy, rebuilding those relationships after being so isolated, but it was worth it. I realized that I didn't have to do this alone, that there were people who cared about me, who were willing to be there for me even after everything that had happened. As for Melissa, I didn't hear from her much. She kept her distance, which was fine by me. The few times we did talk, it was brief, usually about the kids or something related to the divorce. She had lost her job shortly after the scandal broke, and from what I heard, she was struggling to find her footing again. Part of me felt sorry for her, but most of me didn't. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. That wasn't my problem anymore. One afternoon, about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, she called me out of the blue. Her voice was shaky, like she'd been crying, but I didn't let that affect me. We weren't in that place anymore. I was just wondering, she started, her voice faltering, if we could meet up, just to talk. I miss the kids, and I don't know, maybe we could. Melissa, I cut her off, my voice firm but not unkind. There's nothing left to talk about. She was silent for a long moment, and I could hear the emotion in her breath, like she was trying to hold it together. I know, she whispered. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I closed my eyes, letting out a slow breath. I know you are. But it doesn't change anything. I've moved on, and I think you should too. She didn't argue, didn't try to plead or beg like she had before. Instead, she just whispered a quiet, okay, and the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a while, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, maybe. Closure, definitely. But more than anything, I felt a sense of finality. This was really over. Not just the divorce, not just the marriage, but the weight of everything that had come with it. Melissa was out of my life for good now, and that was the way it needed to be. A few days later, I found myself back at the park with the kids. They were running around, laughing, completely oblivious to how much had changed over the past year. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was able to enjoy the moment without the weight of the past dragging me down. I sat on the bench, watching them play, and I realized something. For so long, I'd been defined by what Melissa had done, by the pain and betrayal she had caused. But now I wasn't that person anymore. I was just Kevin, father, friend, and someone who was finally starting to heal. I wasn't sure what the future held. Maybe I'd start dating again. Maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I'd move to a new city, start fresh. But whatever happened next, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let the past define me. I had survived the worst of it, and now it was time to live again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the playground, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The future was wide open, full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, I was ready to embrace it. I watched the kids laugh and play, their joy infectious, and I smiled to myself. Whatever came next, I was ready. This was my new beginning, and I was finally free to move forward. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew everything was going to be okay.